The projection for the Confederates, having estimated the fair market value, presuming 7 layers of $800 billion worth of business contracts, which then would facilitate all of the stable services and their locations, such as the malls and the rest of them. This, including the entirety of the materials, would actively be constructed off of the exchange of trades which, having actively compounded on each other, would sustain themselves in the full metric diversity of the trades and their consequences, which would be automated inside of the contracts, which David Bowles would have already had set up with the system which they believed as the obstructing value, materializing the saturation, at which point the securities, having already been sold inside of the contract, would materialize their protections concerning the viability of their taking over the services, such as the buying of the company, which then would facilitate their active subportion being sold, such as the sale of the objective contract opportunity, which then would be subordinated as automated pieces for their employees and so forth, which would then dissolve the thing and acquire the real world realization from the arbitrary market that they had purchased from the trade, with the full securities having been arranged in its entirety. This, being the estimate, was the foundation argument for the rest of the patriarchy, and therefore the seizing by human trafficking by surveillance terrorist operators, who would then replace the consciousness from the body with the second party who would be conveying the system, similar to their mind control structures, which then, having taken over the body of the particular target, would then materialize their active experimentations concerning the control over minds and the progress for the creating of the mark of the beast, which is the foundational loyalty in their creation of revelation and its government. As a piece of insurrection, as they've sold the right of conquest of the United States and of its allies in their systematic stacking treasons, which has at its core identity the prospects of the agreements, which then allows them to, in a similar way, to construct that system, including the disillusionment of their former nations which they would be selling out, in which case it being pieced apart by the other opportunities would then materialize the destruction by those invasions from the sale of the right to conquest, which would then engage in military actions as it is a sold right of conquest. And therefore the security which had been purchased for the area, having left itself, like in 9/11, when Giuliani was told to remove the air security in New York, had sold the right of conquest for the 9/11 terrorist attack to happen in the aiding and abetting operation for the Confederacies and their white supremacist communism in this arrangement in the stacking operation to destroy society, at which point they, engaging in the blackmail, extortion, and silver fees, would then actively, through false flags, react to their obligation of accelerations in the funding of defenses as a byproduct of defrauding the general public, who, receiving the terrorist attack, only has a few solutions, of which includes the ability to increase spending on the security, which then assists and accelerates and promotes the people who were responsible for the terrorist attack, buying them off with more powers and resources for having done the terrorism in the first place, which, systematically being exchanged by the black market, requires the control over the information, which systematically dissolves the distributions of subportions in the black market, where they aid and abet each of the activities as a mutual protection in order to corner their specific unique qualities of the black market and its acquired taste, which then allows them the privileges of the crime market as an aider and abettor of the larger criminal scheme, which would then seek to engage in the protections of Confederates as immune for their crimes of treason against the United States, which is a confession to the destruction of the United States as a suicide bombing, which then materializes the action of all of its particular component parts of being guilty of treason, and therefore anyone who is not suicidal or disloyal to the United States is immediately and eminently obligated to engage in absolute force as retaliation in the obligations to conduct national security and the preservation of themselves, their families, their communities, and of the connecting systems of the rest of society and the nation and of its allies, which, having been bound by law in order to conduct that security, must separate from the insurrectionist parasite and engage in the full retaliation, which, by definition, is the objective of the restraints of David Bowles in these obstructions, which then engages in the freezing of his accounts, which then, being frozen, are incapable of solving the problem originally estimated for him to solve, which then maintains the inability of the nation to protect itself appropriately, as necessary precautions in order to succeed would find those most competent in order to do so, who, by definition, would not be able to do so unless they were competent to perform the service, which would then use all of the available resources concerning their obligations in the due diligence of law, which requires them the unfreezing of David Bowles' title in its full restoration so that he can do his subordinate portions of those security functions, at which point they, not being insubordinate, being competent to perform the service, would subordinate themselves to their automated function, mastering their specialties alongside the function as the readjustment back into the American system, away from the frozen tundra that is the insurrectionist preparation for the destruction in the planned invasion. These obstructions are actively supported by their aiding and abetting, including the position of their fake charities, which then, engaging in non-charity, materialize the strategy of war against society, such as the position of the original arrangement where they would need David Bowles' approval for XYZ, in which case they would have had to conduct purchases and associations and contracts and entanglements in order to have justified that, and therefore conducted the cost of business in order to have proceeded according to those arrangements, which by definition require them to accomplish a positive sale or an affirmation in that business meeting, which requires them to have subordinate business meetings while waiting, maximizing their potential concerning the success of the trade of that exchange, which then maintains the function of its various benefits. Now, in that benefit, they, having conducted the preparations in those meetings, would have conducted improv structures such as their investments in the original associates, such as with Hollywood, which then maximizes the overlook of the mastery of the arts concerning acting and therefore improv, and therefore the impromptu function of their exchanges, having actors pretend to be David's character representing the thing, allowing them to master the repetition and practice, becoming comfortable as they rehearse it in their heads in preparations to execute on the appropriate meeting, has those subordinate meetings and their practice sessions in order to have maximized their viabilities. Now, this being as a source of fraud against the record would then convey the presumption of their actor pretending to be David as David, according for the purposes of charity, in which case the terrorisms from the RICO would actively have assaults of the POW who was restrained and gagged in the censorship operation and can do nothing except for the fact of being trafficked and abused, is being retaliated for the non-compliance of other parties in the RICO. which then engage in the function of their human trafficking for the purposes of the crafting of that illusion, which then does the subordinate meanings of the parties pretending to be David in those meetings in order for them to have maximized those leverages so that they can defraud the records in the selling of the concept of the actor being actually David, which in fact is not, and therefore the function of it being fraud and forgeries for the purposes of the distributions of the advancement of their criminal agendas by these extortionary functions, which is commonly used for the purposes of voter fraud, which allows them to get their communist insurgents into the elected positions as they reinforce their ability to sell the right of conquest of the general society, which is gutted like Giuliani did in 9/11